Body Knows, Episode 17, The Body Under Siege, Chronic Stress and the Biology of Survival. Hello, and welcome back to The Body Knows. Today, we begin a new chapter in our journey, one that shifts from acute shocks and individual betrayals into something far more insidious, but just as life-shaping, chronic stress. If trauma is a sudden storm, chronic stress is the endless drizzle that soaks into everything. You can't always point to the single thunderclap that frightened you, but you know you've been damp for months, years, maybe decades. And your body knows it too. It records the long haul, the unrelenting pressure, the grind of uncertainty and vigilance. In this episode, we'll explore what happens when stress doesn't end, how your body, mind, and spirit adapt, survive, and sometimes collapse under its weight. We'll talk about cortisol, adrenaline, inflammation, and the allostatic load that scientists use to describe what happens when the system stays switched on. We'll look at how this plays out in everyday scenarios, workplaces, family systems, financial precarity, and even the wider social and political landscape. And as always, we'll ground this in personal reflection, cultural lenses, and practical tools to reclaim space for recovery. Let's begin acute stress versus chronic stress. It helps to begin with a contrast. Acute stress is the sharp jolt when you swerve to avoid a car, or when your boss drops a last-minute demand. Your heart races, adrenaline spikes, your pupils dilate, and glucose floods into your muscles. Then, once the event passes, the parasympathetic system should restore balance, slowing the heart, digesting food, and returning to baseline. Chronic stress is what happens when the off switch breaks. Instead of spiking and resolving, the system hovers at medium-high alert for days, weeks, or years. It's like a car idling at 5,000 RPM, technically still running, but unsustainable. The result is wear and tear on every system: cardiovascular, immune, digestive, hormonal, even memory and mood. Neuroscientist Bruce McEwen called this wear and tear allostatic load. Unlike homeostasis, which is about stability, allostasis is about adaptation, the process of achieving stability through change. When demands never stop, adaptation itself becomes exhausting. Cortisol. The double-edged sword cortisol is often demonized as the stress hormone, but it's also what gets you up in the morning, helps regulate blood sugar, and keeps inflammation in check. The problem isn't cortisol itself, it's the dysregulation. In short bursts, cortisol sharpens focus, mobilizes energy, and dampens pain. In chronic states, cortisol stops cycling properly. It may stay elevated too long, disrupting sleep and appetite, or it may crash too low, leaving fatigue, brain fog, and depression. This dysregulation shows up in daily life. You lie awake at 3 a.m. replaying conversations. You crave sugar or caffeine to jolt your system. You notice your hair thinning, your gut rebelling, your skin breaking out. These aren't just in your head. They are the visible fingerprints of a nervous system under siege. The physiology of chronic stress. Let's walk step by step through what happens in the body when stress doesn't end. 1. Brain perception, neuroception. The amygdala flags danger. The prefrontal cortex, meant to regulate, gets overruled. The hippocampus, which should record context, becomes impaired, memory fragments, time distorts. 2. Adrenal activation. The hypothalamus signals the pituitary gland, which signals the adrenal glands. Cortisol and adrenaline flow. Heart rate rises. Blood is redirected away from digestion toward muscles. 3. Immune shift. Initially, the immune system gears up and inflammation increases to prepare for injury. But long-term activation suppresses immunity. You catch more colds, heal more slowly, or develop autoimmune conditions. 4. Digestive impact. Blood flow away from the gut slows motility. Chronic stress means chronic indigestion, IBS, and ulcers. The gut microbiome shifts, further altering mood and immunity. 5. Hormonal disruption. Cortisol imbalances ripple outward. Sex hormones, estrogen, testosterone, dysregulate, thyroid function can falter, and cycles become irregular. Libido fades or spikes unpredictably. 6. Brain plasticity. Prolonged cortisol shrinks dendritic branches in the hippocampus, memory, and prefrontal cortex, executive function, while strengthening connections in the amygdala, fear. Translation. You remember fear vividly, but struggle with planning, calm reflection, or joy. This is why survivors of long-haul stress describe life as a fog, punctuated by jolts of fear. Scenario. The hostile workplace. Imagine a workplace where every day carries a low-level threat. A boss who nitpicks in front of others. Colleagues who compete rather than support. Constant restructuring that leaves you uncertain if you'll have a job next month. On the surface, nothing explodes. But your nervous system doesn't care that the threats are only professional. It registers danger every morning when you swipe your badge, when you see the boss's name on an email, when you overhear whispers of cuts. The result? Elevated baseline cortisol. Digestive problems occur because lunch is eaten under tension. Shallow breathing, tension headaches, disrupted sleep. You may even startle at home when your phone pings because your body has learned notification, threat. In this way, the hostile workplace becomes not just a source of stress, but an environment that colonizes the nervous system. Even when you leave the office, the imprint remains. the body's betrayal or protection. It's tempting to see chronic stress as failure. Why can't my body just calm down? But the truth is more compassionate. The body is protecting you with the tools it knows. If the environment is unsafe, vigilance is adaptive. The betrayal comes not from the body, but from systems, workplaces, governments, and families that normalize unrelenting pressure. Capitalist productivity culture praises grind and hustle, even as it quietly shreds bodies from the inside. Political systems weaponize fear to keep populations docile. Families shame rest as laziness. In other words, chronic stress is often systemic before it is individual. Recognizing this is key because it shifts the narrative from self-blame to structural awareness. My reflection, the long drizzle. When I look back on my own life, I can see the stretches where I lived in this state. Not just the acute traumas, but the slow grinding pressures. Times when money was scarce and bills piled up, when the uncertainty of tomorrow sat like a stone in my chest. Times when relationships didn't explode, but carried a daily undercurrent of criticism or withdrawal. Times when I pushed myself through work or study, masking fatigue with caffeine, pretending all was fine while my body quietly broke down. I remember the irritability, the exhaustion, the sense that joy had become impossible. I remember feeling as if I was living several seconds behind life, my mind foggy, my body heavy. These weren't random flaws of character. They were the signs of a nervous system in siege mode. And though at the time I felt shame for not coping better, I can now see it differently. My body was doing its best to survive conditions it was never designed for. It was sounding alarms, trying to save me, even if I couldn't always hear, recognizing the signs of siege. How do you know if you're living under chronic stress? Some signs are obvious: constant fatigue, disrupted sleep, and digestive issues. Others are subtler: irritability out of proportion to events, feeling detached from joy, even when good things happen, startling easily, even in safe spaces, difficulty concentrating or remembering details, a sense of time blurring, days, weeks, months slipping by, reliance on substances, alcohol, sugar, caffeine, to regulate energy, cycles of collapse, pushing hard, then crashing, then pushing again. The body whispers long before it screams. These are not personal failures. They are signals. We've mapped what chronic stress is and what it does. We've seen how cortisol, adrenaline, and inflammation shift from allies to liabilities, how the hostile workplace mirrors broader systemic pressures, and how our own lives bear the marks of long-haul vigilance. Now we'll move deeper into how chronic stress reshapes time, memory, and relationships, and why it feels like your body is carrying a war that never ends. We'll also begin introducing practical steps to slowly lower the baseline, because healing from chronic stress isn't about eliminating all pressure, but about teaching your body to rest again. The shape of time under siege, when life becomes one long state of stress, time itself begins to distort. It no longer flows the way it used to. Days blur together, weeks collapse into each other, and the future feels less like an open horizon and more like a thick fog you can't see through. People who've lived with chronic stress often describe their sense of time as slippery, fragmented, or suspended, like they're moving through life, but never really inhabiting it. This isn't poetic exaggeration, it's neuroscience. The stress response doesn't just alter your heart rate or digestion, it literally reshapes how your brain encodes and retrieves memory, how it plans, and how it perceives sequence. Under siege, time is no longer linear. Why stress warps time? Let's start with the brain structures most implicated in time perception and memory. The hippocampus, central to consolidating memories and situating them in time and place. Chronic cortisol exposure shrinks dendritic branches here, impairing its ability to do its job. You remember fragments but not sequences. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning, impulse control, and long-term vision. Under stress, blood flow is diverted away from it, weakening your ability to hold on to a future goal or imagine stable outcomes. The amygdala, hyperactive in chronic stress, primes you to notice danger over continuity. The brain becomes tuned to what might hurt me next, rather than what is the next step in my plan. This trifecta creates a peculiar paradox. You remember what hurt, often vividly, but you lose the thread of time around it. Trauma loops, déjà vu of fear, and the feeling of it's happening again all emerge from this neurobiological pattern, living week to week. One of the clearest illustrations of this is financial precarity. When you're living paycheck to paycheck or benefit to benefit, as many are in today's austerity economies, the long-term collapses. Imagine someone juggling rent, utility bills, and groceries. Their nervous system isn't calculating retirement plans or 5-year strategies. It's calculating survival. Can I pay the rent this week? Can I feed the kids today? Each bill that arrives is another stress spike. Each phone call from an unknown number might be a debt collection. This isn't just about poverty. Middle-class workers under crushing mortgages or precarious gig contracts describe the same narrowing of focus. Chronic financial stress collapses the imagination of the future. You don't think in decades, you think in days. Time becomes short-circuited. And because the hippocampus is compromised, even the past blurs. You might not remember which bill you paid last week or whether you sent that email, not because you're careless, but because your brain is rationing resources under siege. Weight loss, vigilance, and the nervous system in my own life. I remember a period where the effects of chronic stress were visible not just in my mood, but in my body itself. During a relationship I now believe was with someone showing strong narcissistic traits, I lost weight at a frightening pace. At the time, I couldn't fully make sense of it. I wasn't consciously dieting, and if anything, I often reached for quick comfort foods. Looking back, I can see the physiological pattern. Chronic stress can accelerate metabolism in unpredictable ways. Appetite hormones like ghrelin and leptin swing out of balance. Cortisol dysregulates blood sugar, digestion falters, and the body begins cannibalizing reserves. For me, the weight loss was a somatic red flag. My body was sounding the alarm long before my conscious mind was ready to accept the truth about the relationship. That is the cruelty of chronic stress. You may still be trying to convince yourself everything is manageable, but your body refuses to play along. It manifests in sleep loss, hair thinning, rapid weight changes, and immune collapse. These aren't superficial cosmetic issues. They are time markers etched into flesh. Something is deeply wrong, and it's not resolving. The fog of siege time psychologists often describe chronic stress as a cognitive load. Imagine your working memory, the mental notepad where you hold phone numbers, instructions, or to-do lists, as already full of flashing alerts. Danger here, uncertainty there. When that load maxes out, you stop encoding daily events cleanly. That's why people in long-haul stress say, I can't remember the last few weeks. I feel like I'm always behind. Time just disappears. It isn't laziness or carelessness. It's the hippocampus struggling under the weight of cortisol and adrenaline. Time itself becomes foggy. And when time is foggy, hope begins to wither because hope relies on a believable future. Scenario: the perpetual job insecurity. Take the case of someone in a corporate job where redundancies are constant. They never know if their role will exist next quarter. Meetings are full of coded hints, streamlining, optimizing, strategic restructuring. Every whisper feels like a threat. Their nervous system adapts accordingly. Sleep is disrupted, digestion is unstable, and cortisol stays high. But more insidiously, their perception of time shifts. They may stop booking holidays months in advance because who knows if I'll still be employed. They may avoid long-term commitments because the ground could disappear at any moment. Time collapses into the short term, not because they're incapable of planning, but because their body doesn't trust the future. When the future feels unreal, philosopher Martin Heidegger described anxiety as the confrontation with the nothingness of the future, the vertigo of possibilities. Chronic stress twists the insight into a permanent state. The future doesn't feel expansive, it feels impossible. This can bleed into relationships too. Survivors of long-haul stress often struggle to imagine stable love or safe bonds. Why invest years into something when tomorrow feels so shaky? Why believe someone's words about the future when your body has been trained to expect collapse? This is why many people under chronic stress oscillate between overcommitting impulsively to grasp at certainty and withdrawing entirely to avoid future pain. Both are nervous system strategies to cope with the fog of time. Reflection. My own siege fog. Looking back, I can see how chronic stress eroded my sense of time. There were years where I lived almost entirely in survival mode, counting days, not decades. I remember the guilt of missing appointments, the shame of forgetting conversations, the self-criticism of not following through. But behind all of that was something deeper. My body was simply overwhelmed. Even when outwardly I seemed functional, studying, working, socializing, inwardly I was drifting in fog. My body's vigilance consumed the resources that should have gone to memory and planning. And while I carried shame for that at the time, I now understand it as a predictable consequence of the biology of stress. My nervous system wasn't broken. It was doing its job under siege conditions. The hidden cost of siege time. One of the cruelest effects of chronic stress is how invisible it can be. Unlike a broken bone or a dramatic panic attack, the fog of time doesn't always draw sympathy. To others, you might seem forgetful, flaky, or even unreliable. But beneath that perception is a body working overtime just to keep you moving forward. This invisibility compounds the stress. You start to mask more, to overcompensate, to apologize for things you can't fully control. The result is double stress, the stress itself and the stress of covering it, toward repair. The good news is that the same neuroplasticity that allows stress to warp time also allows recovery. Practices like grounding, orienting, and temporal anchoring, which we'll explore later in this episode, can begin to retrain the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. Slowly, the fog can lift and the future can reopen. But first, it requires recognition. If time feels collapsed, if the future feels impossible, if memory feels fractured, this is not a personal defect. It is the body under siege, and naming it is the first step toward freeing it. We've explored how chronic stress alters time perception, memory, and the future horizon. We've seen it in financial precarity, workplace insecurity, and even in the somatic signals like sudden weight changes. We've reflected on the fog of siege and the shame it carries. Next, we'll turn to the body of inflammation, how chronic stress shows up in the immune system, the gut, and even the skin. Because stress isn't just in the mind, it etches itself across the entire organism, often in ways that doctors mislabel or miss entirely. The body of inflammation. If stress warps time in the mind, it sets fire in the body. Chronic stress is not just a psychological state, it is a physiological blaze that, if left unchecked, smoulders through every system. Inflammation is the smoke that signals this fire. For years, medicine treated stress as an intangible mental factor, something separate from physical illness. But research has confirmed what survivors have always known. Stress lives in the body. It lodges in joints, guts, skin, hormones, and immunity. The nervous system may whisper danger, but it's the immune system that picks up the megaphone, rallying inflammation again and again. From protection to poison, inflammation, like cortisol, is not inherently bad. In fact, it's essential. When you cut your finger, immune cells flood the site, releasing cytokines that trigger redness, swelling, and heat. This inflammation is short-lived, designed to heal. But under chronic stress, the same process gets hijacked. The hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal, HPA axis keeps firing, cortisol floods unpredictably, and immune cells remain activated long after the threat is gone. Instead of resolving, inflammation becomes systemic. Over time, this chronic low-grade inflammation is linked to autoimmune disorders like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and multiple sclerosis, metabolic disease, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular risk, hypertension, atherosclerosis, neurodegeneration, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. Mood disorders, depression, anxiety, and bipolar cycles often show inflammatory markers. It's as if the body's army can't find the battlefield, so it fires everywhere, damaging its own tissues. The gut under siege. One of the first casualties of chronic stress is digestion. The gut is lined with neurons, sometimes called the second brain, and is densely populated with immune cells. Stress reroutes blood away from digestion toward muscles, slowing motility. Over time, this leads to IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, ulcers, and gastritis. Leaky gut, where intestinal permeability allows toxins to leak into the bloodstream, further driving inflammation. Shifts in the microbiome, beneficial bacteria starve, while stress-tolerant species overgrow. The gut-brain axis means these changes don't stay local. Altered microbiota can influence mood, cognition, and even social behavior. You don't just feel stressed in your stomach helps perpetuate the stress. Skin, hair, and hormonal markers stress often announces itself through the surface of the body, breakouts or eczema flares. Hair thinning or loss, stress-induced alopecia areata, menstrual irregularities, or worsened menopause symptoms. These are not cosmetic inconveniences. They are visible stress signatures, somatic signals that the siege is ongoing. Too often, society dismisses them as vanity concerns when they are in fact profound indicators of systemic inflammation. Scenario: the caregiver's burden. Imagine a woman caring for her partner with a chronic illness. Her days are filled with medication schedules, hospital visits, and the emotional toll of watching someone she loves decline. At first, she copes. She pushes through fatigue, keeps meals on the table, and reassures her partner. But months turn to years, sleep erodes, digestion rebels. A rash appears, then joint pain. She tells her doctor she feels run down, but tests come back inconclusive. The hidden fire of inflammation isn't captured in a single blood draw, yet it is there, slowly reshaping her physiology. This is the cost of long-haul caregiving, not just emotional exhaustion, but immune dysregulation. And because society rarely acknowledges caregivers' bodies as under siege, the burden is borne silently. My reflection: inflammation in disguise. In my own journey, I've seen how chronic stress shows up as inflammation. At times when life was most overwhelming, my body carried the marks: digestive turmoil, rashes, and unexplained aches. Doctors framed these as isolated symptoms, but I've come to see them as connected, threads of a wider fabric woven by stress. They weren't random. They were messages. My body was telling me, you are under siege. One period stands out vividly. While juggling study, financial pressure, and a relationship full of tension, I noticed my body losing weight rapidly, my skin breaking out, and my immune system faltering. At the time, I blamed myself for poor self-care. Looking back, I see it differently. My body was signaling the load had become too great. It was burning energy to survive, even if I couldn't consciously admit the toll, the hidden stigma of stress illness. Because stress illnesses don't always show up clearly on scans or tests, they're often dismissed as psychosomatic. But this word is misleading. Psycho and soma mean mind and body, and the reality is that all illness is psychosomatic. The immune system doesn't ask whether a threat is real or imagined. If the brain says danger, inflammation follows. This creates stigma for sufferers. People with autoimmune flare-ups, IBS, or chronic fatigue often face disbelief, as if their suffering is less valid because it's linked to stress. But the truth is the opposite. Stress-related illness is not weakness, it is physiology. It's the body doing what bodies do under siege. Philosophy, and the fire within philosophers too, have long recognized the body's response to pressure. The Stoics advised cultivating equanimity to preserve inner harmony, not because they dismissed stress, but because they knew its corrosive power. Buddhism framed stress, dukkha, as the fundamental condition of existence, emphasizing practices that calm the inner fire. Modern existentialists point out that much of our stress is born of systems, economic, political, and social. To carry inflammation in our bodies is to carry the injustices of the world, metabolized into flesh. In this sense, stress illness is not merely personal but political, a symptom of living in a world that demands more than human nervous systems can sustain. Toward healing the fire, if stress creates inflammation, what can survivors do to cool the body's fire? Research and practice point to several pathways: anti-inflammatory lifestyle shifts, prioritizing whole foods, sleep, and regular movement; breathwork and vagus nerve stimulation, activating parasympathetic pathways to downregulate the immune overdrive; somatic therapies like trauma release exercises, massage, or craniosacral therapy to help the body discharge tension; mind-body practices, meditation, yoga, tai chi, not as quick fixes but as long-term rewiring; community and compassion, because loneliness itself is inflammatory. Social connection is one of the strongest protectors against immune dysregulation. These are not panaceas. They don't erase the systemic roots of stress, but they remind the body that safety is possible, that rest is allowed, that healing can begin. Inflammation is the body's smoke alarm, blaring not because you're weak, but because the system is overworked. Chronic stress transforms a protective fire into a consuming blaze, etching itself into gut, skin, immunity, and mind. We've seen how the caregiver's burden, relational stress, and systemic pressures manifest in immune dysregulation. We've reflected on how invisible yet profound stress illness can be, and we've glimpsed the practices that help cool the fire. Next, we'll move into the relational dimension, how chronic stress reshapes bonds, households, and communities. Because siege doesn't just isolate, it ripples outward, shaping how we love, argue, connect, and break. Relationships in the stress cage. Chronic stress does not confine itself to the individual body. It spreads outward, reshaping the patterns of our relationships, altering the texture of family life, and rippling across communities. If trauma bonds are the intense loops that tie individuals to abusers, then chronic stress bonds are the slow scripts that entangle households in cycles of irritability, silence, conflict, and disconnection. It is no accident that survivors often describe stressful homes as cages. A cage may be safe from outside predators, but it restricts movement, dulls spontaneity, and makes every gesture feel like survival. The stress cage is invisible, built not from bars of metal, but from cortisol, vigilance, and the unspoken rules that develop when everyone's nervous system is under siege. The science of stress contagion. Stress spreads. This is not just a metaphor, it is biology. Through mirror neurons and empathic resonance, humans pick up on the subtle signals of each other's nervous systems. When one person in a household is tense, hypervigilant, or withdrawn, others unconsciously adapt to that state. A raised voice primes others' amygdalas, even if the words are neutral. A slammed door spikes heart rates in nearby rooms. A withdrawn silence registers as a threat, evoking anxious pursuit or defensive avoidance. This is known as social allostatic load, the way environments of stress amplify each individual's stress load. A single chronically stressed member can tilt the emotional climate of the entire group. Attachment under siege. Relationships rely on the dance of attachment, reaching out, receiving, soothing, and separating. Chronic stress disrupts every step of this dance. In some, it creates irritability. Constant vigilance makes patience evaporate, so small annoyances spark disproportionate reactions. In others, it creates shutdown. The nervous system conserves energy by withdrawing, leading to emotional unavailability. For many, it creates inconsistency. Moments of tenderness followed by sudden coldness, as the system oscillates between seeking connection and defending against threat. Over time, these patterns mirror those of insecure attachment styles. Children raised in stressed households often internalize this as normal. Love is anxious, inconsistent, or absent. Adults under siege can unconsciously repeat the same dynamics in their partnerships. Scenario: walking on eggshells. Picture a household where the father works a job in constant jeopardy, with layoffs always looming, shifts unpredictable, and bosses demanding. He comes home drained, edgy, his cortisol high. The children quickly learn to read his footsteps. Heavy means anger, light means calm. The mother modulates her tone depending on his mood, soothing when he's irritable, withdrawing when he's silent. Conversations tiptoe around him, as if the whole family is dancing on eggshells. No one says we are under stress, but every nervous system in the house knows. Heart rates rise when he enters. Jokes are tested cautiously. The stress cage becomes the atmosphere itself, invisible but heavy. This scenario is not unique. It plays out in countless homes where chronic stress, whether from work, poverty, illness, or conflict, becomes the unspoken third presence in the room. Personal reflection. Stress in connection. In my own life, I felt how chronic stress reshaped my relationships. There were times when I longed for closeness, but my nervous system was so burdened that I met others' presence with irritability or withdrawal. I remember the guilt of snapping at people I loved, not because they had done anything wrong, but because my body had no bandwidth left. And I also remember being on the other side, dating someone who seemed to observe me like a hawk, noting my behaviours, anticipating my reactions. What might have been curiosity instead felt like surveillance, and under stress I felt caged. One particular incident stays with me. They delayed leaving for an outing, then made a comment that struck me as deeply disrespectful. My body surged with the need to leave, and when I did, I noticed they made no effort to stop me. Later, I reflected that this felt orchestrated, a way of creating distance while shifting blame onto my reaction. Whether or not my suspicions about their intent were correct, the nervous system doesn't wait for proof. It reads subtle differences, tone, timing, and absence of repair, and encodes them as threat. Chronic stress magnified this perception, making my body a constant lie detector, whether I wanted it to be or not. The intergenerational cage chronic stress is not just contagious within a generation, it cascades across generations. Children raised in high-stress homes often develop heightened vigilance themselves. They learn to read micro-expressions, to anticipate shifts in tone, to modulate their behavior to keep the peace. This isn't just psychological, it's epigenetic. Research shows that prolonged stress can alter gene expression, particularly in pathways related to stress hormones. These changes can be passed down, priming the next generation to heightened sensitivity. What one generation calls walking on eggshells, the next may carry in their cells. The stress cage becomes hereditary. Philosophy of the stress cage. Philosophically, chronic stress in relationships raises questions about freedom. Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre argued that humans are condemned to be free, always choosing. But chronic stress narrows choice. If your body reacts before you decide, if your relationships are shaped by unrelenting vigilance, how free are you? Others, like Foucault, might argue that the stress cage is one of the most effective forms of control. When systems induce chronic stress through economic insecurity, media fear, or political instability, they don't need to overtly police relationships. People police themselves, internalizing vigilance, silencing their needs, walking on eggshells with each other. Practices for the stress cage. How do we begin to dismantle the stress cage in relationships? No single practice fixes the systemic roots, but small shifts can begin to restore safety. 1. Naming the cage. Simply acknowledging we are stressed breaks the silence. It externalizes the problem rather than blaming individuals. 2. Micro-rupture repair. Instead of letting small irritations calcify, practice quick repair. I snapped, I'm sorry. It wasn't about you. These repairs reassure the nervous system that the connection is safe. 3. Schedule decompression. Families or couples can schedule stress release activities together, a walk, music, or even shared silence, to reset the collective baseline. 4. Somatic grounding in pairs. Practicing breathing together, holding hands with awareness, or even lying side by side in silence can co-regulate nervous systems. 5. Boundaries with compassion. Recognizing when another's stress is spilling onto you and setting limits, not out of rejection, but out of care for both nervous systems. Chronic stress does not stay contained in individuals. It reverberates through households, shaping love, conflict, and silence. It teaches children to anticipate threats, partners to misinterpret signals, and families to live in cages of vigilance. But by recognizing stress contagion, by naming the cage and practicing repair, we can begin to loosen the bars. Relationships don't have to be battlegrounds of cortisol. They can also be sanctuaries of healing if we dare to notice and act with compassion. Next, we'll widen the lens again from families to culture. In the next section, we'll explore how chronic stress is not just personal but systemic, how entire societies live under siege, and how media, politics, and economics exploit our biology. Culture of siege. When stress becomes a way of life for individuals, it rarely stops there. It scales. It becomes the mood of a household, the weather system over a town, the season of a nation. The body's biology, cortisol cycles, adrenaline jolts, and inflammatory surges get braided with language, symbolism, policy, and media until what you feel in your chest is indistinguishable from what you scroll, watch, and overhear. This is culture as a stress amplifier, a feedback loop where institutions generate vigilance, and vigilant bodies reproduce the institutions that keep them on edge. We've been mapping chronic stress as it lives inside one person. Here, we widen the lens to society under siege, how labels, narratives, and political theatre train nervous systems. We're not adjudicating left versus right. Both can operate as control frameworks. We're asking something prior. What happens in bodies when legitimacy is granted or withdrawn by a label? How do cortisol, shame, anger, and freeze propagate through crowds, living rooms, and timelines when leaders dismiss rather than dialogue? And how can people carry their dignity somatically when the air is heavy with accusation? The cultural physiology of a label words are not neutral. A single word from a podium can shift parasympathetic tone in millions of bodies at once. Threat, terrorist, far right, far left, enemy, traitor, extremist. Each is a neuroception trigger. The brain does not politely wait for footnotes. It makes fast categorizations that recruit the amygdala, tighten intercostal muscles, alter heart rate variability, and reroute blood flow away from digestion. The body hears the category and prepares for the consequence. When an establishment voice labels a group protesting safety concerns, livelihoods, or community stability as extremist, a cascade unfolds. For those inside the labeled group, cortisol spikes, breath shortens, a sense of moral injury flares, and the vagus nerve loses tone, less social engagement and more fight-flight. For bystanders unsure where they stand, ambiguity rises, the orienting response intensifies, and many default to freeze fawn with authority to avoid social risk. For those opposed to the labeled group, the label brings relief. Oxytocin bonds the in-group through shared contempt, and out-group dehumanization inches forward. This is not a unique phenomenon tied to a single country or leader. It's the political physiology of modern media democracies. And it exacts a price. A nation's vagal tone can drop. Baseline heart rate variability declines. Sleep gets worse. Trust collapses. Scenario: you're not citizens, you're categories. Citizens gather because they believe their safety, services, or neighborhoods are under strain. They have concerns about migration policy, policing, and resource allocation, messy human concerns. They assemble, speak, and chant. Later, or even in real time, a national leader frames them wholesale as far right. Cameras magnify the worst frame. Commentators talk over the footage. Timelines fill with ridicule. Now let's slow this down somatically across 5 vantage points. 1. The person in the crowd anticipation. In the lead up to the event, catecholamines rise. Palms sweat. There's a mobilizing mix, purpose plus alertness. This can be coherent if there's a sense of lawful assembly and care among participants. The ventral vagal system stays partly online. Speech and chant. Chanting synchronizes breaths. Oxytocin bonds strangers into a we. Co-regulation buffers stress until the label hits. The label lands. A push alert pings. National coverage calls the assembly far right. For many, the amygdala jolts. Threat to reputation plus threat to belonging equals social death risk. Heart rate climbs. Peripheral vision narrows. Some feel heat in the face, others nausea. Appraisals split. Fight anger rises, jaw sets, volume increases. Flight. A surge of calculation. Can I reach the station before the police kettle this street? Freeze. Dissociation edges in, sound dulls, time distorts. Fawn. Someone starts explaining to nearby cameras, over-smiling, over-clarifying, desperate to earn safety. After dispersal, back home the body trembles. Hands shake while making tea. Sleep fractures. Dreams rehearse arguments never voiced. Appetite is off, the gut is tight. I know that sensation because I've carried it in my own body. Times when I was gaslit in relationships, told my reactions were unreasonable or my perceptions untrue. I felt the same gut churn and rapid heartbeat. Watching groups dismissed in the same way by those in power, I recognized the echo. My body responded before my head could form the thought. It knew what it was witnessing. 2. The mother at home is watching the broadcast. She sees the label scroll under the footage. Her breath catches. She tells herself she doesn't care, but her body reacts. Blood drains from her face, hands clench. Later that night, she'll dream of chaos even if she never attended the gathering. 3. The racialized shopkeeper on the route, he worries the unrest will turn toward him. His cortisol rises, heart palpitates, though he wasn't part of the protest. Stress contagion has no borders. 4. The officer in the line trained to maintain composure, but his mirror neurons still pick up the anger in faces before him. His sympathetic nervous system activates, and sweat pools under armor. His sleep will be jagged that night too. 5. The leader's communications room. The advisors congratulate themselves on narrative control. But what they've actually done is spike cortisol in millions. Countries' allostatic load just rose. Gaslighting at scale. The experience of people who felt they were advocating for safety but were dismissed as extremists is gaslighting at scale. Lived signals are reframed as illegitimate. The body says danger, the broadcast says shame. When that split repeats, outcomes are predictable. Some double down, radicalized by anger. Some collapse, disengaging from civic life. Many oscillate, fraying relationships. This is why the moral status of dissent matters physiologically. When authority honors dissent as participation, even in disagreement, ventral vagal remains available. When authority ridicules dissent as pathology, bodies default to defense. I've noticed it in myself too. During times of prolonged stress, especially in relationships where I felt constantly observed or invalidated, my weight dropped rapidly and my sleep fractured. I thought it was weakness or poor coping, but now I see it was my nervous system screaming that the environment wasn't safe. That's why I believe cultural dismissal and labeling land so deeply. They don't just stress the mind, they erode the body. Cultural gaslighting and the personal echo. What chills me is the similarity between interpersonal gaslighting and cultural gaslighting. In both, the nervous system is forced to distrust its own signals. At the personal level, I've lived through relationships where I was told my perceptions were wrong. At the public level, citizens are told the same, that what they fear or see isn't valid. For me, these moments of cultural gaslighting mirror what I've lived interpersonally. It's the same double bind. If I speak out, I risk being caricatured as unstable or extreme. If I stay silent, I betray myself. Neither option feels safe. That's why I've come to believe freedom isn't just about speech or movement. It's about the freedom of the nervous system, the right to inhabit your own signals without shame. Living in a culture of siege is like carrying someone else's panic in your chest. It seeps in through headlines, labels, and dismissals until your nervous system is shaped by narratives you didn't choose. I've felt it personally, and I've seen it politically. And in both, the damage is the same. The body learns vigilance, shame, and exhaustion. Practices for lowering baseline arousal. If culture can train us into vigilance, it means there's also a way out. Chronic stress isn't simply the presence of cortisol or adrenaline. It's the absence of balance, the inability to return to baseline once the surge has passed. And while we can't switch off the world's headlines, we can learn to remind our nervous systems that not every moment is a crisis. I've had to learn this the hard way. For years, I didn't know my body could ever feel safe. Stress felt permanent, like my normal. When I started experimenting with small practices, I discovered something important. You don't have to fix the whole world to reclaim pieces of safety inside yourself. And every time your body tastes calm again, it rewrites a little bit of the script. The nervous system's need for rhythm, the body thrives on rhythm. Not perfection, not rigid schedules, but recurring patterns that let the nervous system know what's coming. Stress collapses rhythm into chaos. Sleep becomes erratic, eating irregular, and attention fragmented. That's why one of the first steps in lowering baseline arousal is restoring micro-rhythms. Breath rhythm, deliberately lengthening exhalations, even for a few minutes, signals the vagus nerve to engage. Movement rhythm, walking at a steady pace, swaying or rocking, can reset the vestibular system. Daily rhythm, waking and sleeping within a consistent range, builds predictability, teaching the body that not every night is survival mode. I've noticed that when I lose rhythm, my stress multiplies. When I recover even small rhythms, 10 minutes of morning breath work, an evening walk, it's like turning static into music. Grounding and orienting. When stress is high, the body often acts like the world has shrunk to one threatening point. Vision narrows, hearing dulls, and you feel like prey cornered by a predator. Grounding and orienting undo this contraction. A simple practice. Pause and name 5 things you can see, 4 you can feel, 3 you can hear, 2 you can smell, 1 you can taste. It reopens the sensory field. Another, turn your head slowly and let your eyes land on different corners of the room. This cues the brain that the environment is wider than the perceived threat. I've used orienting in difficult moments, after arguments, when walking into tense environments, even when scrolling social media that spikes my anxiety. It's astonishing how much calmer the body feels when it realizes there are exits, options, and horizons. The role of co-regulation. We're social mammals. Stress isn't meant to be handled in isolation. One of the most effective ways to lower baseline arousal is co-regulation, allowing another nervous system to help soothe yours. It doesn't require words. Sitting with a calm friend, sharing silent eye contact, or even holding a pet can change physiology faster than self-talk. Polyvagal theory highlights this. The ventral vagal system activates most readily in safe, attuned relationships. There were times in my life when I tried to do everything alone. I thought resilience meant self-reliance. But the truth is, every breakthrough I've had in healing stress has come through connection. Not with everyone, but with people whose presence didn't demand I hide my signals. Signs of nervous system distress. Part of lowering baseline arousal is recognizing when it's been spiked. Many people don't notice until they're already in meltdown, shutdown, or exhaustion. Here are signs worth watching for: somatic, clenched jaw, shallow breath, trembling hands, digestive discomfort. Cognitive, racing thoughts, intrusive images, inability to plan or focus. Emotional, irritability, sudden tears, disproportionate anger. Behavioral, pacing, withdrawing, compulsive checking, phone locks, news. I've learned to treat these not as failures, but as early warning signals. My body is saying, you're carrying too much, slow down. By naming these signs, I interrupt the spiral before it deepens. Journaling the body. Another practice that's helped me is body journaling. Instead of writing about events or thoughts, I write about sensations. Tight chest after phone call, gut churn watching the news. Over time, patterns emerge. Certain people, places, or stories are linked to certain sensations. This builds self-trust. It shows that your body is consistent, not random. And when you see those patterns in black and white, it becomes easier to prepare and protect yourself. Sleep is a political act. It might sound strange, but I believe sleep is political. In a culture that thrives on keeping people exhausted through economic stress, constant notifications, or binge-worthy streams, choosing to prioritize rest is rebellion. Stress narrows time, sleep re-expands it. During deep rest, cortisol drops, immune repair accelerates, and memory consolidates. Without it, stress compounds. Restoring sleep hygiene, dimming lights, silencing devices, and regular routines isn't a luxury. It's the nervous system repair. I used to treat sleep as optional or would sleep very little, something I could sacrifice for productivity. But chronic stress taught me otherwise. Without rest, I wasn't just tired. I was easier to manipulate, quicker to react, slower to discern. Choosing sleep was choosing sovereignty. Small practices, large impact. You don't need hours of therapy or meditation to shift baseline arousal. Even 30-second practices matter. Place a hand on your chest and exhale slowly. Stretch your arms wide, expanding your physical posture. Hum or sing, vibrating the vagus nerve. Step outside and look at the farthest horizon you can find. Each of these is a micro reminder to your body. You are not in immediate danger, and each repetition makes it easier to return to baseline when stress surges again. Personal reflection. One thing I've come to understand is that healing isn't about eliminating stress, but teaching your body how to return from it. I've lived through periods where I thought vigilance was permanent, where my body carried siege even in quiet rooms. Slowly, through rhythms, grounding, co-regulation, and rest, I've discovered that the nervous system can relearn safety. And what's most hopeful is this: when one body relearns safety, it influences others. Calm is contagious. When you regulate yourself, you permit others to regulate too. This is how we shift not just individuals, but cultures from siege toward sanctuary. From siege to sanctuary, chronic stress is not just about the moments when the heart races or the stomach churns. It's the background hum, the constant drizzle, the cage that narrows not only what the body feels, but also what it can imagine. We've seen how stress reshapes time, how it inflames the body, how it leaks into relationships, and how entire cultures can live under siege without realizing it. And yet, even within this cage, there are cracks of possibility. The nervous system is not static. It can relearn rhythm, it can taste calm again, it can slowly trust that not every moment is danger. Healing is not the absence of stress. Life will always bring strain, but it is the recovery of rest, the ability to return home to yourself. This episode has traced both the intimate and the systemic. From the way cortisol lingers in our blood to the way labels weaponized by leaders can fracture an entire society's vagal tone, we've witnessed stress not as an individual failing, but as a cultural inheritance. If the body knows siege, it can also learn sanctuary. And the practices we've touched on, breath, rhythm, sleep, orienting, and connection, are not small. They are acts of resistance in a culture that thrives on keeping us exhausted. As we move forward, the story widens again, because stress is not only personal, but also historical and collective. Families pass down vigilance, nations inherit wounds, and bodies carry echoes of wars and oppressions they never personally lived through. That is where we go next. In episode 18, Breaking Trauma Loops, we will explore how trauma is not only stored in individual nervous systems, but also in the shared memory of whole communities. We'll look at epigenetics, inherited states of fear and resilience, and how children absorb the unfinished business of their parents. And we'll ask what it means to heal not only ourselves, but generations. Thank you for walking this path with me. I hope this episode offered not just insight, but compassion for yourself, for others, and for the body that still longs to be seen. You've been listening to The Body Knows, James Miller.